sin go? What does it affect? That sounds pretty encompassing. It affects all of creation. It affects. I would suggest that stuff didn't collide in the atmosphere before the fall. I mean, it affects a lot of things. What is the extent to which it affects us, and in what ways? Hmm. Wow. That puts us in an extremely dangerous position, doesn't it? It depraves our intellect. Means our minds aren't going to think right. Our minds are warped, twisted, broken. We don't think right. I have often tried to describe heaven as it's literal, it's real. God made man, put him in the garden with the intent that he would not know death. So it is a real, not just physical, but it is truly physical existence, much like now with the absence of sin. The problem we have is we're so warped by sin, we can't picture what the absence of sin would look like. We can't shape that in our minds. It depraves our intellect. I don't know, maybe you've noticed, if you look about you, you don't have to look far. Sometimes it doesn't take more than looking in the mirror to know that people don't think too great sometimes. It defiles our hearts. I mean, the innermost part of our being is corrupt. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, the scripture says. Yep. Desperately wicked. It affects our will. Thus the issue with obedience to God. See, in the garden, Adam had free will, right? He could choose to obey, or he could choose to eat of the tree that God said don't eat. Since he chose, to eat from the tree that God said don't eat, and his will continually chose in opposition to God. He would not, on his own, choose to do what pleased God. Neither would you, or neither would I. We don't naturally choose what pleases God. We naturally choose what benefits and pleases ourselves. That's why humanity looks the way it does. It destroys detours our affections. That means we like the things that we shouldn't like. Why do we sin? Yes, the enemy is deceptive. But if it didn't look appealing, if we weren't at all interested in it, we wouldn't do it. There's a myriad of sins and vices that people could be impacted by. Not all of them are appealing to us. Right? There are some things that some people struggle with that maybe you don't grasp why they struggle with it because you don't have a problem with that. But they do. There are people that struggle desperately with alcoholism. It doesn't interest me at all. It doesn't. It doesn't have any appeal. Maybe because I've seen the effect enough to the point that I'm like, no. But for some, it's very real. We want things that we shouldn't want. And it increasingly deflects our worship. That's something that maybe we don't talk about as much. You know, it makes sense that our minds are messed up, our affections, our will, all of that. But it deflects our worship because we were made to worship Him. And instead, we tend to worship ourselves. Sin is that pervasive throughout our being. It affects every aspect. Well, I don't want to dismiss the Sunday school classes on that note, so let me just end with this. My sins, they are many, His mercy is more. You may be dismissed to your classes. Matthew 5. Next few weeks in Sunday school, we're going to entertain some questions and try to press some of this a bit more as we continue to work through chapter 5, chapter 6, Jesus' teaching. And we find some interesting conflicts in at least in our mind, how it is that we are to function. It's not too far along here in the text that we encounter, the favorite verse, chapter 7, judge not that you be not judged. That is assumed to mean don't judge, and yet the scripture says the spiritual man just judges or discerns all things. So, what do we make of this? And there's a balance that we have to find. It's unfortunately far too easy to be critics of others that we think are either too far this way or too far that way. But the difference between we never compromise and surrender truth. But at what point do we, not cast our pearls before swine? And at what times do we, like Jesus on occasion, really shake up the hornet's nest? Have you ever entertained yourself with something like that, by the way? With a hornet's nest? An actual hornet's nest? Really? It can be rather entertaining for spectators, at least, I think. But years ago we were up at hunting camp, and out by the road in front of the cabin was there. There's the whatever that thing is on the side of the telephone pole, and on the bottom of it was this large hornet's nest, and it was up there a little ways, So, one of the guys had brought a football, so me and another guy, we played catch with football. see who could hit it best and knock it down. And yeah, we were successful. I made a successful strike. I will admit it took us quite a while, but I hit it, knocked it down. But you see, there's an advantage to having some idea what can happen after. So he was on the road side, and I was on the cabin side. So actually, I think nobody got stung in that endeavor, but it was entertaining. But do we do that in society? Do we shake things up? Do we just, we live in a world that people are very, very easily offended. Do we go out of our way to speak the truth and offend them, or do we, where's the balance? And so there's a lot of questions that we want to ask. We need to struggle with in our own life and come to this balance. We started verse 29. Jesus is shaking up the religious realm significantly, and most often it's those that he is frustrating. And he demonstrates that the narrow behaviors expressed in the law are intended to be more broadly understood to include the attitudes of the heart. You can see where this goes, because you can take any of the issues of our day, whatever side people polarize themselves to, and you take the environment. I mean, there's a myriad of options we could choose from. There are those who could be seriously angered that some people don't do enough, because, after all, God made this, we're stewards of it, and so they press an extreme position that perhaps we should do far more. But if you talk to someone who thinks that they are saving the environment by certain measures, and you point out that those measures are indeed really not beneficial, they're really harmful, they just sound on the surface, because of the way they're marketed, they sound like they're good, they get upset with you. They'll shut down the argument. They won't talk. Why? Well, because they think that what they're doing on the surface makes them a better person. And if you tell them otherwise, they don't like it. So, in essence, Jesus is doing just this. We start at verse 27. There is a continual repeat of, you've heard it said, you've heard it said. Back up to 21. You've heard it, that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. Whoever murders is liable to judgment. I say, if you're angry with a brother, you're guilty. So he extends this to attitudes of the heart, not just obvious or evidence of particular behaviors. You're offering a gift, and someone, you remember your brother has something against you. Leave your gift, take care of it with your brother, and go back. Come to terms quickly. Deal with things. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Same thing with adultery. You've heard it said, don't commit it. I say, don't lust. The intent of the heart makes you guilty. Then he makes these seemingly outrageous statements. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. Throw it away. That's rather harsh, isn't it? For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And he continues, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. Does he intend for us actually to do that? What is his point? And what makes it obvious that he doesn't intend for us literally to do that? To me, at least, there seems like a very obvious connection here in the text, very obvious indicator. He has just gone through and said, it's not a matter of looking like you're keeping the law on the outside, it's a matter of the heart, right? It's not a matter of whether you actually use your hands and physically harm and murder your brother. If the attitude of your heart is wrong, well, you're just as guilty. So, if you dismembered yourself, you'd still be left with a heart that chooses to do or think what it ought not. Right? So, what's his point? Why does he say this? So you can still picture things in your mind with your eyes closed. Is that right? You don't have to pluck your eyes out for to comprehend this. But if we remove our heart, our literal heart, we have a significant physical issue to contend with at that point, don't we? And he has broadened the specifics of the law that you could check the boxes and say, 9 out of 10, I'm not too bad, right? Or 4 out of 10, needs improvement, but hey. He's broadened it to the attitudes of the heart to make it very, very clearly obvious that we all stand equally guilty before God. So, what happens here? Jesus has just previously said, you're the salt of the earth. Salt's lost its taste. How can it be salty again? You're the light of the world. And people don't hide a lamp. They don't buy a lamp to bury it, to fuse it to the point that it's unusable. You want it to shine forth so you can see with it. How are we to apply these two representations in life? Not by any external salve. It's not going to work. It's a significant alteration of the heart. That's a little harder to deal with, isn't it? It's amazing how quickly some people's brake lights come on when they are approaching a state trooper. I mean, you can see the front end of the car go down, and you can see the brake lights go on. Their speed's already been recorded on the radar. And not that you heard this from me, but a significant amount of times they're headed to a call, and unless it's really, really egregious and unsafe, they're not going to circle back and do something about it. But then again, they might be just cruising, looking, and you don't know which is which, so, you know? It's the attitude of the heart. In other words, if we're content trying to just appear good on the outside, we are no benefit. That's why he says in 17, don't think I came to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And I want you to understand really what the whole purpose is, what's behind all of this. So it's deeper than an external, or deeper than just an external show of behaviors. Which would lead me to ask a question like this: what currently hinders us from being the salt and light that we ought to be? What currently hinders us from being the salt and light that we ought to be? That's what he calls us to be. So what inhibits our ability from doing that as we ought? Sin. To which he then goes and shows sin's a whole lot deeper than we think it is. It's inner motivation, thought, it's the very root of our being. It becomes behavior. What would, you ever wondered what makes people do some really, really, really stupid things? Now, where did that come? What would make you think that's a... So, because of the intrinsic nature of our being, our inability to do what we ought to be to the extent that we should, is Jesus in verse 29 and 30, is he advocating self-harm or not? So why does he say it? If he doesn't seriously intend for us to maim our bodies, and he made us. They're important to him. We don't harm ourselves. We don't intentionally do that which is destructive to our bodies. The obvious answer to me seems to be that he does it to show both the depth of sin and its impact in our being and the urgency and necessity to which we must be concerned about taking care of sin. Because even if you tried to narrow yourself, which is what they had done, to the externals of the law and checking some boxes, Jesus has just shown that they are guilty of hell. So that's why they didn't like him very much. It didn't take too long to start to irritate some of the people. They thought they could check boxes and look good on the outside, and he proves to them that they are worthy of hell, and that this matter needs to be considered with the utmost urgency and seriousness. It is far better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. Now, if your right hand causes you to sin, cutting it off, guess what? Your mind's still going to wish that you had that arm to do things that you shouldn't do. If we spent more time seeking victory over sin in our life, do you think it would have any impact in the ability that we would have to be salt and light that we ought to be in the world? It would. It would. It would indeed. What about oaths? Again, you've heard it said, verse 33, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." So what about oaths? Isn't an oath like a promise? Shouldn't we seek to provide assurance of something and then carry through? I mean, that there seems to be a connection of responsibility there, right? You do that when you go for a job, you find an employer, and you, in essence, commit to being there at a certain time, working a certain duration of hours, and accomplishing a certain task. On the other end of it, they make a similar commitment that you do this, we'll pay you this much, we'll take care of these issues, and there's, in essence, a promise between the two. Isn't an oath similar to that? Why would Jesus say, don't do it? What's interesting to me is Matthew is the only one that shares this. The other gospel writers do not. The Jews had developed such an elaborate system of meaninglessness in relation to oaths. Maybe we could compare them to political promises. They may all sound good, but few actually carry through. And then you have those who, they sound really good, but they have no intention whatsoever of actually carrying through on their promise. Now, there are some political promises you hope they don't intend to keep, right? And there are others that you wish they would, but they don't. They don't have any intent. Or maybe they say it because it sounds good and it might get them elected, but they kind of really realize that there's not a chance for them to pull this off. They don't do, How many times have you seen that? That's why you see the polarization, I've tried to get this stuff to happen, but, it's the other side that's just opposing it all. So, I've made this promise and I'm trying to be faithful to it, but, they won't let me, so it's beyond their control. And they knew that going into it, but they made the promise anyway because that's what they thought people wanted to hear. The Jews had done this over and over with a myriad of things. An elaborate system of meaninglessness, making promises they don't intend to keep. That's ridiculous. But are we ever guilty of that? I'll give you an example. This is the perfect time of year for this. To say, boy, it's so busy with the holidays. We need to get together after the holidays. How often does that happen? Next thing you know, it's July and time for summer vacation. Right? Did you intend to keep it? Maybe, maybe not, but, But the Jews had this, it sounded so good. They weren't carrying through on anything. Jesus' point was man should not perjure himself by making promises and not keeping them. Don't do that. If you're going to do something, simply say you're going to do it. If you have no intention of doing it, be honest enough to say you're not going to do it. Right? Don't tell somebody you're going to pray for them if you have no intention of faithfully carrying through and doing it. They might not know, but God does. Followers of Jesus should be clear. Yes or no? We should be those who keep our word. And it should be simple. Not like 1,500 pages of legislation. It should be simple and clear. Not encumbering, just clear. Any of you familiar with the ghost and Mr. Chicken? Surprising amount of positive response to that question. I was indoctrinated with that prior to being allowed to marry my wife. I think it's one of her dad's favorite movies. But so he, Don Knotts, he leaves the diner in a flurry and says on the way out, "Put that on my tab." To which the response is, "You haven't got a tab." But such a thing was common. Remember, as a kid, my grandfather would stop by the hardware store in the middle of the week. So there were times that I would ride in town if they had one car, and if Grandma needed the car for something for the day, she'd take him to work and then go back and pick him up. Sometimes I'd ride with her when she'd go back to pick him up. And stop by the hardware store, and if he needed something, he may not have the cash to get it. Nobody had credit cards back then. But I remember walking in the hardware store with my granddad. I was just a tiny little, and sometimes I was grateful for this because sometimes it was he would just get a little pack of small nails, because then I could sit in the basement and I could pound those nails into a piece of wood while he's working on the workbench beside. Great times. Guy behind the counter would let him have them, but the promise that end of the week when he got paid, he'd square up. End of the week, he got paid, he'd stop at the bank and cash a check. No, there was no direct deposit back then. And then he'd swing by the hardware store and pay up and go home. That was common. It was, a handshake was as good as a signature or better. It meant something. And they had gotten to where their word didn't mean anything. We should be those who keep our word. We should be those who are dependable. We should be those who we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. We open the next can of worms, we'll be here through the next hour, so I should not jump too far ahead on that. Keeping our word comes from inside, doesn't it? It's really, saying things that sound good that we don't intend to actually carry through on indicates that our desire is to please others. The evidence here is that we ought to be interested in pleasing God above all. So, understanding that we should be those who are faithful to our word and keep our commitments, recognize that can't be accomplished just externally, but it includes an attitude of the heart. Say that, don't lose that thought, because he jumps quickly into the issues of retaliation and loving our enemies, which is not just accomplished by a limited external show, but an attitude of the heart. Father, this morning we're grateful that the power of Christ, the power of your Spirit within us, can change our hearts, can move and motivate and shape and alter us, conform us to the image of Christ, to remake what was destroyed, damaged, broken in the fall. Yes, our desire is that we would look decent to the viewing world that observes. We certainly want them to see something good. Ultimately, what we desire is that they see Christ. So may we, from the innermost part of our being, reflect Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.